Bill Wallace called Chuck Norris slow to his face. Chuck asked him to repeat it one more time. The words came out quiet. So quiet that the men standing closest leaned in just to make sure they'd heard right. Bill Wallace didn't flinch. He was the fastest kicker in American karate, Superfoot they called him, and he'd earned the right to say whatever he wanted in any room he walked into. He looked straight at Chuck Norris and said it again. "You're slow, Chuck. I've watched the film. Your hands are slow." The room didn't go silent. It had already been silent. 12 men were in that gym, and every single one of them stopped breathing at the exact same moment. What happened next was never officially recorded. No camera captured it. No magazine printed it. But the men who were there, they carried it for the rest of their lives. This is that story. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand what Bill Wallace and Chuck Norris were in 1974. They weren't just fighters, they were institutions. Chuck Norris had already retired from full-contact competition by that point. Undefeated, 6-time world middleweight karate champion, a man who'd beaten the best fighters on the continent and then simply walked away from the sport before anyone could beat him. He'd trained under Bruce Lee. He was making films. He was building a legend that would outlast any trophy. Bill Wallace was something else entirely. Bill Wallace was active. Bill Wallace was hungry. And Bill Wallace had a left leg that moved so fast it registered on film as a blur. 3 techniques: hook kick, side kick, roundhouse, all from the same chamber, all delivered in under a second, all aimed at the head. He was the PKA World Super Middleweight Champion, and nobody had figured out how to stop those kicks. His right leg had been badly injured years earlier, a judo accident. The knee was essentially fused, so he'd done something remarkable. He'd built his entire system around a single left leg, and he'd made that limitation so devastatingly effective that opponents forgot he even had a right side. These were 2 of the most dangerous men in American martial arts history in the same room in Los Angeles in 1974. And one of them had just called the other one slow. Because what happens next will change how you understand both of these men forever. It began the way most dangerous conversations begin, with honesty. There was a training session, a small, invite-only gathering at a private gym, the kind that didn't have a sign on the door and didn't need one. The men inside didn't need advertising. Their reputations walked in before they did. The discussion was technical. Film analysis. Someone had brought reels, actual 16mm reels from tournament footage, and they were being screened on a wall. Fighters studying fighters, breaking down mechanics, timing, reaction gaps. Chuck Norris was watching his own footage. That alone tells you something about the man. Most champions don't want to see their weaknesses projected large in front of their peers. Chuck sat there, arms crossed, eyes forward, watching himself move. Then, Bill Wallace spoke. He wasn't trying to start something. That's the part people miss when they hear this story filtered through legend. Bill Wallace was, and still is, one of the most technically honest men in martial arts. He said what he saw. He always said what he saw. That's what made him great, and what made him dangerous in rooms where egos were the most fragile things present. Your hands, Chuck. Watch the hands. They're slow compared to the feet. Technically, he wasn't wrong. Chuck Norris was an elite kicker. His spinning back kick was a thing of mechanical perfection, power generated from the hip, acceleration through the turn, devastating at impact. His hands were good, but against someone like Bill Wallace, whose visual processing and physical speed existed in a different category, Chuck's hands clocked slower on film. It was a technical observation. In that room, with those men, at that moment, it landed like a declaration of war.
Chuck didn't respond immediately. That silence, people who were there have described it differently. One man said Chuck's expression didn't change at all, which was somehow more frightening than if it had. Another said there was a slight tightening around the eyes, not anger, something colder than anger. Assessment. Chuck Norris was deciding something. Bill Wallace, to his credit, didn't backpedal. He held the frame. He leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, but certain. The body language of a man who believes in what he's saying and has the record to back it up. "I'm just saying what's on the film, Chuck. You want to be faster, you need to work the combinations differently. Start with the hand, draw the guard, then kick. You're telegraphing." He was coaching him. That's what was happening, technically. The fastest kicker alive was offering technical coaching to a 6-time world champion in front of 12 witnesses. One of those witnesses later described what happened in the room as the moment the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Chuck looked at the film on the wall. Then he looked at Bill Wallace. Then he said, because most people in Chuck Norris's position say nothing. They absorb the insult, file it away, and let the competition floor deliver the answer. Chuck did something different. He invited the confrontation closer. Bill Wallace repeated it. So, word for word, slowly.
And then Chuck Norris smiled. Not a warm smile, not a performative smile for the room, a small, private smile. The kind a man makes when the world has just arranged itself into exactly the shape he needed it to be. "Okay," Chuck said. He stood up. He didn't make a speech. He didn't posture. He walked to the center of the floor, turned around, and stood in his fighting stance. The same stance visible on the film still playing on the wall behind him. He looked at Bill Wallace. Every man in that room understood what was happening. This was not an official sparring session. There was no referee. There were no rules about contact level. There was no one to stop it if it went somewhere nobody wanted it to go. This was two champions, in private, finding out who was right. Bill Wallace rose from his seat. He didn't hesitate, you have to give him that. Another man might have found a way to soften what he'd said, to turn the technical observation into a compliment, to step back from the edge. Bill Wallace walked forward. He was the PKA world champion. He had never been knocked down. His left leg had never been stopped. He walked to the center of the floor. He took his stance. 12 men leaned forward. Here is what the witnesses described, not what was rumored, not what grew in the telling over 40 years. What the men in that room actually said happened. Bill Wallace moved first. He feinted with the shoulder, a classic Bill Wallace setup, designed to get the eyes to blink, to pull the guard, to open the high line for what came next. The kick launched. Left leg, hook kick, targeting the side of the head. The same technique he'd used to finish world champions, the same technique that had existed on film in 12 countries, the same technique that had never, not once, been cleanly defended when he decided to throw it at full speed. It didn't land. Chuck Norris wasn't where the kick was going. He'd moved, not back, laterally, off the center line, a half step that took him out of the arc before Bill's foot had completed its travel. And as the kick passed, Chuck's right hand was already moving. Not a punch, a controlled stop, palm forward, the technique you use when you want to demonstrate something without hospitalizing someone. He placed his hand against Bill Wallace's jaw, controlled, precise, certain, then pulled it back. The fastest kicker in American martial arts had thrown his signature technique at full commitment, and Chuck Norris had moved around it and put his hand on Bill's jaw before Bill's foot returned to the floor. Bill Wallace stood there. The witnesses disagree on the expression on his face. Some say he smiled immediately, that he was the kind of man who could appreciate being outplayed, because that's what made him great. Others say there was a longer pause, a moment of recalibration, a man updating a system of beliefs he'd held for years. What everyone agrees,
He didn't argue. Bill Wallace was many things. Arrogant was never one of them, not truly. What looked like arrogance was confidence built on evidence, and in that moment, the evidence had just been updated. Chuck Norris had read the feint. He'd identified the setup, predicted the kick's trajectory, vacated the space, and landed a counter, all while Bill Wallace's body was still in motion. The hands Bill had called slow had moved faster than his eye could follow in the moment that actually counted. The difference between training speed and competition speed, the difference between what shows on film and what appears in the space between breath and consequence. Chuck walked back to his seat. He sat down. He looked at the wall. The film was still playing. His old footage, his old hands, measured against a stopwatch that never captured what he actually was. "You were saying?" Chuck said. Not loud, not cruel, just even. Bill Wallace laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from a man who has just learned something worth knowing. "I stand corrected," he said. 4 words from the fastest kicker on earth. The room breathed again. Stories like this one don't stay in rooms. They move the way important things always move, person to person, slightly changed each time, stripped of their precision, but never their core. By the end of 1974, people across the American karate circuit had heard some version of it. By the end of the decade, it had become part of the mythology that surrounded both men. What's remarkable is that neither Chuck Norris nor Bill Wallace ever tried to inflate it. Both men, in interviews across the years, have been honest about each other's abilities in ways that champions rarely are. Chuck Norris has said publicly that Bill Wallace was the most technically gifted kicker he ever encountered. Bill Wallace has said that Chuck Norris possessed a level of situational intelligence in a fight that he never fully saw in anyone else. The ability to be 3 moves ahead while appearing to stand completely still. That afternoon, in that gym in Los Angeles, it wasn't Chuck Norris defeating Bill Wallace. It wasn't even really a fight.
It was a lesson that ran both directions. Bill learned that what you see on film is not what you face on the floor. Chuck learned, or confirmed, something he'd been studying his entire martial life, that the most important movement in any fight is the one that happens before the fight thinks it started. That separates martial arts legends from martial arts champions. Champions win. Legends understand why they win, and then they teach it. People make the mistake of thinking Chuck Norris was a puncher who kicked, or a kicker who punched. He was neither. Chuck Norris was a reader, a pattern recognizer, a man who had spent 20 years cataloging the way human bodies betray their intentions before they complete them. The slight forward lean before a combination, the shoulder dip that precedes a kick, the blink that follows a feint, the half-second of commitment that opens a counter window and closes just as fast. He'd trained under Bruce Lee, and what Bruce Lee gave him, beyond the physical techniques, beyond the philosophy, was a framework for understanding what a fight actually is at its deepest level. Not a collision of bodies, a competition of perception. The man who sees most accurately, most quickly, and responds with least hesitation, that man wins. Always. Not the strongest, not even the fastest, the one who reads the room correctly before anyone else has finished asking the question. Bruce Lee called it the style of no style, the emptying of preconceptions so that reality can land on you unfiltered. That afternoon, Bill Wallace's technique was perfect, his setup was textbook, his execution was exactly what it always was. Chuck Norris just wasn't where the technique expected a man to be. That's the difference between studying an opponent and being present for an opponent. Bill had studied Chuck on film. Chuck was present in the room. Film shows you what happened. The room is where what happens, happens. Bill Wallace retired from competition in 1980, undefeated as a professional. His record stands to this day.
He went on to become one of the most celebrated instructors in American martial arts history, passing on the technical genius of that left leg to a generation of fighters who never stopped being amazed by it. Chuck Norris builds something else entirely. He took the philosophy he'd absorbed from Bruce Lee, the technical mastery from 20 years of competition, the quiet confidence from 1,000 moments exactly like that afternoon, and he poured it into a career, a school, a system called Chun Kuk Do, and eventually into the cultural consciousness of an entire country. The films, the legend, the name that became synonymous with a kind of calm, unstoppable lethality. Neither man needed that afternoon to become who they became, but that afternoon clarified something important for both of them and for the 12 men who witnessed it. Speed is real, power is real, technique is real, and all of it, every ounce of it, can be nullified by a man who understands the space between what you intend and what you do. Somewhere in a private conversation, years after that afternoon, Bill Wallace was asked about Chuck Norris, about that day, about what he'd said and what happened after. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said, "I called him slow. He proved me right." He let that land. Then he smiled. "He was so slow, he let me throw first. He waited until my kick was already gone before he moved. Any faster man would have panicked and jumped too early. Chuck was so controlled, so patient, that he looked slow right up until the moment you realized his hand was already in on your face." That's the lesson. The most dangerous man in any room is not the one moving fastest. It's the one who has already decided when to move and is simply waiting for you to confirm it. Chuck Norris was never slow. He was just finished before you started.